Welcome to Suffolk Matters, where all of Suffolk County meets the men and women of Suffolk AME. News, opinions, and insights you won't hear anywhere else. Here's your host, the president of New York's largest independent union, Suffolk AME's Dan Levler.
Welcome to another edition of Suffolk Matters on Walk 97.5 and 94.3 The Shark, where Suffolk County meets the men and women of Suffolk AME. News and views you can't hear anywhere else. So my guest this morning is Rob Calarco, the presiding officer of the Suffolk County Legislature. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning, Dan. How are you today?
It's another fine day. I mean, just a year of firsts all around, some good, some bad. But, you know, I think there's a lot for us to talk about this morning. You know, we have some election stuff behind us, but looking ahead, we've got to get into you know, what's on the horizon for the Suffolk County Legislature and how that'll impact Suffolk County. But let's just start with your background. You know, let us know how you got involved in all of this and where you've been leading up to this point.
Yeah, well, listen, 2020 has been certainly an interesting year, and you know, this was my first year as the presiding officer for Suffolk County Legislature, and I got to be honest with you, Dan. I mean, we came into this year knowing there were issues we wanted to tackle, but also looking at it being the first of what I thought was going to be some easier years for the county. Our budget was on a good track. We actually ended with our general fund in a surplus in 2019 for the first time in many years. And, you know, we thought we were shaping up for 2020 to be a really good year where we can start tackling new initiatives, tackling issues like diversity that needed to be dealt with in our county, but doing some positive work. And, of course, in March, the COVID pandemic hit, and it kind of brought everything to a screeching halt on us.
Yeah, it sure did. And, you know, back in April, we had you on the show. It was about a month into the lockdown, and we were talking about different things that we thought, you know, could possibly be the case. And many of those things came true. You know, the pandemic had a devastating impact on the county budget, the need for county services, you know, like public health services, emergency services, social services, Department of Labor, things like that. You know, their workload significantly increased to you know, kind of help keep everything together. And then, you know, most importantly, we need, you know, federal aid. You know, the need for the federal government to give back to Suffolk County what it gives to the federal government every year. I mean, routinely we're giving $29 billion additional dollars to Washington that never are returned to the state of New York. And you know, I think when we were talking then about the, you know, the need for federal, you know, aid to, you know, the federal government to just, you know, get past some of the bipartisanship and figure out a way to get aid into Suffolk County, you know, some of the things they were able to do. But I think we're still in a position where we still need, you know, more federal aid.
Yeah, certainly. Listen, Dan, I mean, the pandemic has not gone away. Certainly over the summer, it seemed like it was abating, and we've been doing very well locally in Long Island and Suffolk County in terms of keeping our numbers down. But even now, we, like the rest of the country, we're not experiencing maybe spikes in the same way, but over the last week or so, we are starting to see days where we get 3 or 3.5% infection rates for those tested. And that's alarming, and some of it, I think, came directly from Halloween parties and other small get-togethers, and now we're seeing the governor is imposing some new restrictions on restaurants and gyms, and is telling people to not have gatherings of more than 10 in your personal homes, which I'm sure is aimed directly at asking people to limit the size of their family gatherings for the upcoming holiday season, whether it's Thanksgiving or Hanukkah or Christmas. And, you know, people have to think about if you're from a large family and you're used to a get-together of 25 people sitting around that big table with the turkey passing around, that's what Thanksgiving is really about. And yet it is an opportunity for this virus to spread, and that's what we're seeing with the spikes now, is it's coming from small get-togethers, not from necessarily one giant super spreader event. And that's the challenge we have with our economy getting back on track. We had some good positive growth, but the federal stimulus phased out. People were no longer receiving that extra unemployment check, and certainly for us in local government, the CARES Act money, the rules kind of changed. The Treasury Department gave us better guidance, and we were able to plug some of that into taking care of the massive deficit we're going to face in 2020. But that money by law needs to be spent within this calendar year, and so it's not going to carry over to help us with our 2021 budget.
No, and I think to some extent, at least I feel I'm seeing, some degree of, I guess the way to call it is COVID, fatigue. People are saying like, well, I haven't gotten it yet, and therefore I probably won't. And the big concern there being like, it's hard to predict how it's going to affect a particular individual, but we know there are those at-risk populations. And so even in a smaller gathering, you could pick something up, not necessarily know you have it, and then pass it to someone that wasn't at that gathering. Like you're exposing other people in your network by doing things like that. And it's a lot to ask of people.
You're not kidding. It is. And people are used to being able to go about their business however they so choose. And, it's part of what the liberties that we enjoy of, to be able to live our lives as we wish. And, I've even heard the COVID fatigue in terms of the way you've put it, but I've heard it from constituents in the opposite sense, in that a lot of folks feel like, this thing has already run its course, and it's going to continue to run its course in terms of who's getting affected or not. But because so many people who do get infected with it don't really show symptoms and don't ever really get ill, that I've talked to a lot of constituents who just feel like, what? I've probably already had it. I think I had it back last winter, or, maybe it's already kind of run through us and we're not going to really get sick from it. And, now it's time to start getting back to some semblance of normal. And the reality is we really don't know who has or hasn't had it. We really don't know exactly how prevalent it is through society so far. And we quite honestly don't even know whether or not you can get it a second time yet. So people are understandably fatigued, and they're ready for normalcy, and they're ready to be able to go about their business as they always did. And yet we are now looking at a situation where we are starting to tighten up again, and hopefully the people try to abide by some of these rules so that we don't have a more larger shutdown, because that's in other parts of the country right now. They are experiencing this is almost as severe as we experienced in the spring. There was a number that I just find unbelievable, that it isn't something that people are talking about more, and that's the fact that we had over 1,500 people die across America. We have over 258,000 people dead across this country. We're on track to have, by the end of the year, over 400,000 people dead. That's more people than reside in the town of Islip.
Yeah, and those were preventable deaths in a sense. If this disease wasn't making its way around, that wouldn't be the number. So these are impacts over and above what would normally happen. And to some extent, I wonder how much people are thinking, COVID is basically like the flu. And you see the flu will, normally start on one side of the country and make its way across, and then it goes back again. And, COVID's not behaving that way at all. A place like New York can have a spike and then spike again. And we're seeing in other countries, they've gone through 3 waves already.
And that's the challenge. And then, of course, on the back end of this is people, if we start having more shutdowns, that does impact our economy. That does impact ability for people to work, ability for business owners to stay in business. I do understand the frustration that our restaurant owners are facing right now. They have another restriction coming in that, in reality will limit how much business they're able to do. They're already limited, and with winter quickly approaching now and temperatures dropping, they're not going to have outdoor service as an option, because not many people are going to want to eat outside in 30 and 40 degree weather, and of course colder as the months move on. and that's going to impact them and their ability to stay open and their livelihoods. And so I get that there is really this two-pronged effect that's happening in this pandemic that is really, difficult for people.
Oh, sure. And, I guess that gets us into, some of what we need to talk about this morning, which is the financial impact of COVID and how that, resulted in the budget that you as presiding officer and the rest of the legislature has to go through this year. So, I guess just as a starting point, let's talk about how the budget process actually works.
Sure. So our budget process, and this year is very different than our normal years, because normally the county executive is required to submit a budget to the county legislature for action by, I believe it's the third week of September. And because we're in the middle of a pandemic and the county executive is operating under emergency orders, he was able to postpone that until almost the third week of October. He put it off for quite some time. Because usually we have it in hand and we review it and we make our recommendations and put our stamp on it, so to speak, and pass some sort of amended version of that budget. And we take that budget vote the day after Election Day every year. And this year we have not done that yet. We got the budget much later, and are scheduled to take a vote on our proposed amendments on the 16th of this month. So it's a much more protracted event, but in some ways, because we got it in hand so much later, we've been had less time to actually digest it and make any proposed amendments.
Yeah, and you have a fairly open process. There's a budget working group. There's public hearings. Members from any walk of life in Suffolk County have the ability to address the budget working group and bring up whatever concerns they may have.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a number of public hearings, both two general public hearings for the operating budget, as well as a week of committee-based public hearings on the various departments within the county, and the public had every opportunity. And we, while we're not allowed to have in-person public hearings, we made those available for people to come and speak via our Zoom process, as well as submitting other comments in other fashion. And the one thing we do in the legislature is we have, as you mentioned, a working group, was something that was started under Presiding Officer Bill Lindsay as an attempt to have a bipartisan process to develop those recommended budget amendments. And we have continued in that process through the years. And this year, as we started last year, we did that completely in public, which was new. When it was first started, the working group would meet downstairs in the basement of the legislative building and do it in a conference room down there. And we started having this as an open process. We live streamed it this year, and the public was able to watch us as we did our deliberative work.
Yeah, I think that's a very important thing to point out because generally speaking, if you don't pay attention to things like this, you just assume, it just happens. Somebody hands over a budget, everybody says yes, and then things are done. This is actually an exhaustive process with input from all walks of life and all different, areas of interest. And there's a lot for you guys to consider. I know at one point in time we had addressed with you. We knew with regards to some of the departments I mentioned earlier, but specifically something like SNAP, which people traditionally think of as like food stamps. There are so many people that never thought they were going to need government services like this that are using government services like this during COVID, and there was a 175% increase in the applications for SNAP.
Yeah, and listen, it's indicative of the situation we're in as a nation, and it's really this weird dichotomy that's going on where you have people in certain industries, and certainly those tend to be more of the white-collar type businesses, or the ones that are deemed essential and necessary, that they kept their jobs through the pandemic. They were working, they were doing great and doing fine, and in some ways, had this pent-up demand because they spent 3 months locked up in their houses with no place to go and no way to spend their money, and unable to take those vacations, or like my family postponed that vacation to Disney that we were planning on taking because of the pandemic, and those people are spending their money. But you have an awful lot of people who worked in other industries, especially in the service industries. And I mentioned restaurants earlier, but if you worked in the tourism industry or the restaurant industry or any of those types of services, you spent those months not earning any income. And even now, while unemployment rates have come down from those highs of 14 and 15%, we're still hovering around 6 and 7% unemployment in Suffolk County. So there's still a lot of people right now who are out of work, not earning income, and they're turning. And these are people who a lot of them were working and never had a problem in their life and never had a challenge paying their bills, and were always responsible. And now they're finding that they're turning and need help with food, and we need help with rent. And I, quite honestly, I'm a bit nervous about what's to come. Besides, when you start having the ability for evictions to start again, and when people's mortgages are coming due, and those rent bills are coming due, and they're unable to pay for it, and all of that puts additional strain on the county and our social services.
Sure, and I guess that really illustrates why government services need to increase in a time like this. And for those of you just tuning in, my guest this morning is Rob Calarco, the presiding officer of the Suffolk County Legislature. And, to that end, I just want to commend you, the rest of the budget working group, for adding a provision into the budget that you had to consider that would allow, if additional state and local aid came in, to, maybe mitigate some of the harmful effects in terms of services people are expecting to receive from their government, that those services can remain in place because the additional aid came in.
Yeah, listen, Dan, I mean, this pandemic highlights just what county government does in a way that I think most people normally don't see. We do the health and safety and welfare of the residents. It is our health department that's been on the front line through this pandemic. Our police department has been on the front line through this pandemic, as well as ensuring people had the right and the ability to go out and protest and exercise their First Amendment rights in a safe fashion during the summer when we had the protests happening regarding police violence in other parts of the country. And this is really who we are. And at the same time, because of this budget crunch that we're experiencing, and because we have not received additional aid from the federal government yet, the county executive's budget is calling for reducing salaries by $27 million, and that equates to approximately 500 people. And these are people who are doing their job every day, showing up to work through the pandemic. And, the last thing that I want to ever have to do is look at anybody who is a county employee and say, I'm sorry, you're going to have to get laid off because we don't have the money. We need to make sure that we keep these people on staff. I mean, even right now, we are calling employees in from departments outside of the health department to do assistance with contact tracing because of the spikes that I mentioned earlier. And, we need to make sure that we make a commitment to these people that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that they're continuing to work for the county. And it's not just about them. It's also making sure that we're making a commitment to the public that we will do everything we can to make sure we're providing them the services they deserve.
Yeah, and I think that kind of illustrates one of the ballot measures that everyone saw this past election cycle was Proposition 2. And the idea on Proposition 2 was to take monies that were normally available, and that voters said, let's sequester this money and use it to stabilize tax rates for sewers. So what Prop 2 did was said, let's convert the excess money for sewer tax stabilization. Let's convert that to the taxpayer trust fund and allow us to keep other government services going in addition to sewers. And we saw a pretty good response on that. As of now, it's about 8% up, in terms of, election day results. And then you just have to wait for mail-in ballots to be counted to see where that ultimately lands. But it is a revenue stream that was identified to help accomplish, smart government in a time of difficult crisis. Were there other ways that you guys were able to realize other revenue streams as part of this budget process?
Listen, this is a tough year, and I think that we are all open to alternative and additional revenues. And I know that the executive's budget does call for increasing property taxes up to the cap within the police district. And as you mentioned, the ballot proposal that hopefully is ultimately approved, and it is up right now, and there are about 169,000 absentee ballots to be counted, so there's still a lot of ballots out there. But that is critical, and what you mentioned about it being for stabilizing taxes in sewer districts is something I don't think the public at large, and certainly some of the folks who have opposed this measure, really grasp. I mean, at the end of the day, it's called the Assessment Stabilization Reserve Fund because assessment is another word for tax, and it's intended to stabilize those taxes in sewer districts that the county operates. And that was the intention when it was passed in its original version over 30 years ago. What we've gotten to is a point where there is far more revenue or monies there than are needed to stabilize those taxes. And this is an opportunity for us to use them to stabilize taxes and provide services for people as a whole. And it provides us not just with $60 to $68 million of budget relief for the current cycle of 2020 going into 2021, but it actually provides us with some budgetary relief every year out for a few years because it relieves some requirement to repay some of that. And here's what really is the kicker to me about it, Dan, is if we had to pay all that money back, if we did increase that fund back to the $160 million that we would have to if this ballot proposition ends up failing, is that money is really just going to go sit in a bank. And it's great for the county to have some money sitting in a reserves that we're able to borrow against for cash flow purposes in a year-to-year basis. And certainly it helps provide some relief to the sewer districts, but we didn't really need it sitting in a bank account. We need it if there's ever been a rainy day, if there's ever been an emergency crisis. This is it. I recall as the school districts were putting their budget together last spring, and there was one particular district that refused to tap into their reserve accounts, and they were saying, well, the reserve accounts are just there for emergencies, and the public cried out, well, what is more of an emergency than being in a health pandemic where we have to, keep our doors open and provide these services to the public, even though everybody is locked up and inside. And that's where we are right now, and I think people need to understand that until we get through this, which is at least another year out, we're going to still remain in this kind of difficult position.
Yeah, well, and I think also when people are told that, something like Proposition 2 is actually going to impact their drinking water, which is false, of course they would be concerned. If they were told it was going to have an environmental impact, which is false, they would be concerned. And there were a number of interesting stories that were floating out that don't actually, they weren't the truth. And I think maybe some of the people involved in this knew it wasn't the truth, but they had reasons for hoping that this would fail. It definitely looks good for some people to say that somebody's not doing a good job.
Yeah, and listen, if this was to impact the environment in some significant way, or even in a minor way, to be quite honest, you would have seen an overwhelming opposition to it from the variety of very good advocacy organizations out there who are concerned about our environment and our water quality. And the reality is that you didn't see this overwhelming movement amongst all of them. There was just a select few individuals who were trying to make an issue out of this record. What was really interesting and telling to me about it, Dan, was in the past, these organizations had sued successfully the county on similar measures because we didn't put it to the voters. And in this instance, now that we put it to the voters and the voters decided, all of a sudden the voters were not capable of making that decision. And I really find that quite honestly offensive. The voters are very, very capable of understanding and making an intelligent decision.
Sure, and that leads me to what shouldn't be the most difficult part of our conversation, but in this day and age actually probably will be, and that's talking about the recent elections as relates to the national stage. From my perspective, it looks like, from my understanding of things, it looks like we will have a new president. And I know that as I say that, there are going to be folks out in the world that have a vastly different opinion and different take on that. Not in too much of a different way that, there are people who want to mislead people. And that's just, I guess, kind of my take. But no matter what, this is going to have an impact on how America operates, and it's going to have an impact on how the state of New York can handle this ongoing crisis and future crises, and Suffolk County as well. Yes.
Yeah, let me just say first and foremost, and I know that our current president is certainly a divisive figure, and you either love him or you hate him, and there's not a whole lot of people who are in the middle on that spectrum. And, that is just the reality of the world we're in. I unfortunately think to a certain degree it was by design, in that the president certainly just looks to garner support from those who buy into his perspectives, and for everyone else, too bad. And I think ultimately that probably weighed into why the voters made the decision they did. But first, most importantly for people to understand is that our election process is actually a very safe, robust, and effective process. And just by the nature of the way it works in our federated system, where the states control the rules of voting, and then by and large, especially as we do here in New York, the process of actually administering the vote and is passed down to the counties, and it is so set up in such a fashion where you have so many levels that it really prevents any kind of large scale malfeasance. Because it's just in some ways just way too difficult for anybody to kind of do on a scale that can impact, especially a presidential election. I'm not going to say that there's never been an instance of somebody doing something improper, but I would say that especially in this election, the professionals across the state who administer these and are saying it loud and clear that they have had no fraud, no instances of any kind of widespread malfeasance associated with the conducting of their elections. And as I said, Suffolk County has 169,000 absentee ballots to count. That is certainly a very large number compared to what we have had in the past. But we've always had absentee ballot processes, and we've never had elections necessarily certified and finalized on the day of election night. I remember my first election, Dan, to the Suffolk County Legislature, and I was with the party up at the IBW Hall watching the returns come in, and I was down by 10 votes with one precinct left to report, and I left the hall dejected, thinking I had failed to get elected. And by the time I had reached Patchogue, my predecessor, Jack Ennington, called to congratulate me because the last precinct came in. I was up by 15 votes. And the reality is even then we had to sit and we had to wait for the absentee ballots to be counted. I ended up winning by a little over 300 votes. But we didn't know the results until the absentees were counted, and it was not until close to Thanksgiving that we had the results in hand.
Yeah, and we're seeing that play out here as well. This year, there are a number of races that were surprisingly close, and maybe even some upsets, but, we don't know until those final ballots are counted.
There's an awful lot of them, and I think in a year like this, one of the realities that has happened, for better or for worse, is the ability to vote by mail or to absentee ballot was expanded because of the health pandemic, but because of rhetoric from the president about not trusting absentee ballots. You had the situation where now we have about half of all the ballots we've received in Suffolk County coming from registered Democratic voters, and only about a quarter of them are coming from registered Republicans, and the rest are folks who are either affiliated with a minor party or unaffiliated with a party at all. And that's going to skew how those results come out, and I'm not going to say that a Democratic voter necessarily voted for the Democratic candidates, because we certainly don't know that. But it does indicate that these ballots are going to probably lean very heavily towards a Democratic turnout or a Democratic election on the absentees, and how that impacts each individual election will play out as we count them.
Yeah, and that process is going to start Monday, so we'll be keeping a close eye on that. My guest this morning was Rob Calarco, Presiding Officer of the Suffolk County Legislature. Mr. Presiding Officer, thank you for carving out some time to speak with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dan.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, we'll speak to you next week. We'll speak to you next week. We'll speak to you next week. We'll speak to you next week.